So let me introduce then Joanna. Joanna was for many years involved in the French program lower division at Cornell, and she is now an independent scholar, but has stayed very professionally active, particularly in the open education movement, in multiliteracies and literacy approaches to foreign language teaching. And that has included the use of social reading as a tool to get her students to really engage more deeply with text. The title of her talk is called Techniques for Digital Social Reading. It's plural because we are discovering that there are many ways to use digital social reading in the foreign language classroom. And the more we use it, the more we discover it. So we want this to kind of inspire you to test it out and play around with digital social reading tools in your own classroom. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Joanna. Thank you. Have fun, Joanna.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Carl. Of course, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, but I do want to take a moment also to thank both COERLL and COERLL for all of the work that they do in terms of not only supporting the development of open educational resources, but for the dissemination of that information and those best practices through a variety of fora. So I think it's really an incredibly important part of professional development for all of us. All right, so the title today is Techniques for Digital Social Reading, and I'll be talking about various techniques, but more specifically from the angle of intersection between social reading and multiliteracies approaches, so that we can explore what social reading looks like as social meaning making. The agenda for today basically is that in a few moments you're going to actually engage in a social reading yourselves, a simple form of a social reading. And then I'm going to introduce eComma to you. eComma is the app that COERLL developed that's specifically designed for engaging in social reading, and it's pedagogically scaffolded. So I'll just point out several features because that social reading that you will do in the simple form will be fresh in your minds, and you'll be able to imagine what it would look like had it been done in eComma. We'll then go back to the text that you're going to read, and we'll do a bit of an analysis. I've prepared my own analysis, and I'll see how well I can tie in some of the comments that you make, just so that you also get a sense of that. Then I'll show you several resources that COERLL provides, because there is eComma, and I should say the space for digital social reading more broadly, is its own website and has a number of resources available. We'll then take a look more broadly at affordances of social reading and possible applications in your courses. So you'll have a few moments to reflect on what you've heard and to see if you can envision using social reading. And then we'll to conclude, and the Q&A. In the blurb that we had sent out for this webinar, I'd given a basic definition of social reading. Let's revisit it and go a step further. So social reading is an internet-based activity in which a group of people collaboratively reads, annotates, and comments upon a shared text. And in thinking about language teaching, we can simply call it a during reading activity. So I'm going to now give you the instructions for the social reading that you're going to carry out. You can see on the bottom right of your screen a box that says text, comments, / annotations. So the goal of this social reading is to make as much meaning out of the text that I'll show you as you can as a group. So I'm going to ask you to read the text, and in this sort of chat box, type in any reactions, questions, comments that you have, and read each other's input and respond when you have something to add. And I'll give you, I don't know, 5-7 minutes or so to do that, and then we'll come back together. So, you ready? Here is the text, and read, comment, etc.
This is Carl Blythe. I want to give you a little bit of narration of what's going to happen here. This is an actual text activity, social reading activity. And basically what she's just given us our assignment, and I was in the chat room at the time. We're reading through the text and we're about to comment to each other. The whole point of digital social reading is to talk about a text to each other, to other people in the room, in the chat room. So I was the first to start off, and I mentioned, oh, this is about reported speech, and Sybil uses an emoticon. So already you see the social dimension coming out. It's not just talking about the text, but talking to each other about the text. Digital social reading, one of the great things is you see that it has a permanent record of the discussion. You can go back and look at that record and pull different patterns out of the record and talk about who thinks about what. It's not at all a linear conversation, and that ideas begin to develop and take on a life of their own and go in different directions. There's this kind of constant back and forth. So you see Jeff just posted something, and then Simon answers, what is humor and sarcasm? So already somebody prompts a further discussion by asking a question in the classroom. Typically, it starts out very general. Notice that the first couple prompts or comments were about their larger interpretation of the text, and then we start to become more and more specific. So let's see, what Osana just wrote, the student definitely shows an understanding of what the professor explained, plus uses irony. And you see that she's using these emoticons. A lot of the commentary around the text is highly affective. People they don't only talk about the text, they also talk about themselves and their feelings about the text. And that's something that really comes out through digital social reading. One of the things that you can use is, of course, this layering of meaning. So people now are talking here about MIT and the relevance of these different parts of the text. And you can then go back and, as teachers, use that in your further discussion about these so-called rich points. The rich points, there are different kinds of rich points. As I said, they can be the affect, so surprise, annoyance, curiosity. Let's see, what are people saying? Yeah, now it's really starting to heat up. People are talking about something very specific like MIT, which is at the very beginning of the text. So we started off very generally about what it means, and now we're talking about the various elements in the text. What you find is also there's a big fancy word for this is metacognition. People start to talk about how they understand the text as it starts to go on through this discussion, and they ask each other these different kinds of questions that can be very metalinguistic, like what is the grammar, what is the vocabulary, what's this textual structure I don't understand. One of the great things about a social reading is that you can kind of take the text and divide it and conquer it, because people are playing different roles then and helping each other out to understand the general meaning of the text. So here Osana answers and says, it's a valid point that Mark Lewis says, where's Noam Chomsky? So we've gone from a professor to MIT to a very specific Noam Chomsky. And I think that was exactly what I had in my mind, and I felt very validated at that point. Exactly, I write. Okay, so that gives you a bit of an understanding of all the different kinds of things that are going on, but primarily the social dimension changes interpretation. It makes it collaborative. It makes it a lot more fun.
All right, we can start to wind it up if you finish your comments. Okay, let's just take a look at some of the features of eComma as a tool. If you go to the website, I mean, not now, but at some point you go to the website eCOERLL at .coerl.utexas.edu. You will see, for example, that on the left side of the screen you have a text. That's where the instructor uploads a text. In this case, this was something that Carl had done in the linguistics class, and I'll mention this actually a little bit later on Louisiana French Creole. Then in the center, you have buttons, and the first button has already been activated, and it's a word cloud. So every text generates a word cloud. And as you know, a word cloud essentially calculates the frequency of use of words. And so the larger the word in the word cloud, the more frequently it's used. And in the word cloud, you can click on a word of interest. Also punctuation. In some text, punctuation can be quite important. And it will highlight in the text all the instances of that word. So you can easily then locate things in a text. The next button is actually for tagging. So tagging is when you want to label something. And for this particular text, there were 3 tags that were indicated by people. The first one, for example, pre-verbal tense marker. So what you do in order to make a tag is you would highlight, in this case, one of those tense markers in the text, and a window pops up, and it allows you to write the label of your tag and then add that in, and you accumulate a list of tags. And again, if you want to look at what those instances are, you click on the tag, and in that case, it highlights it in the text. The next is the comment thread. And again, when you want to comment on something in a text, so all of you focused on a particular aspect, it might have been triggered by a word or a phrase. And so you would highlight that word or phrase or passage in the original text, and window pops up, you write your comment, you add it to the comment thread. And you'll notice in this particular activity, there were 82 comments, so quite a lot of activity, discussion. And you can reply, of course, and continue an interaction between comments and reactions to those comments. And if the teacher so wishes, he or she can download the comments once the activity is done for further analysis. So it's a very nice tool that can be used in a number of ways. The fourth button is the eComma user list. So here you have the names of each of the participants and the number of annotations that they make. And what you do is you can click on the name and you can see all of those annotations. You can also see them highlighted in the comment thread. And, obviously as a tool for teachers, this can be exploited in different ways. You can simply check to see who may or may not have done homework if this is done asynchronously outside of the classroom. You can also then look at the content of their comments if you want to do some form of assessment. And as I mentioned, you can also print out the whole thread if you want to do further assessment. So there's quite a lot of work that can be done with these buttons in terms of managing. Okay, so now going back to the text, let's unpack meaning and see. You had a wonderful range of responses to the text. So let's see how this might fit in with a kind of basic textual analysis of how meaning was made in this text. So first we examine text genre, and we can see that it follows what you might think of as an American joke, the conventions of an American joke. You have a setup and a punchline, and you also have it in oral storytelling form, and we can see that through the use of present tenses to draw in the listeners. Cultural context, this is something that was much discussed in your group. So we have a prestigious American university, MIT classroom, and as Carl pointed out, it's kind of the personification of theoretical linguistics as opposed to practical. And you also have a professor giving a lecture in linguistics, which is a subject that the, let's say, average American, we're talking about norms here, thinks of as esoteric. So an informed reader's expectations, just reading the setup, let's say, of this joke, so based on those norms would be, oh, this text should involve sophisticated intellectual transmission of knowledge from professor to students. But jokes subvert norms. This is how humor is made, and there was one question about what is humor. So in this case, we find this subversion of norms expressed in a number of ways. So sarcasm or irony in the punchline, by contrasting registers. So the professor is speaking in standard register and some technical terminology in terms of linguistics. The student is speaking in informal spoken register. You have reduced forms in the spoken register, so yeah versus yes and right versus that's right. And when you compare the written forms, you can see the yes, that's right, yeah, right, a shorter version in the reduced form. And then you have, of course, people mentioned intonations. You've got these falling tones and emphatic stress. And so when you compare the spoken forms of, yes, that's right, and yeah, right. So readers who know this usage automatically hear it in their heads while reading. Now, another way that jokes subvert norms is by flipping the cultural scheme. So we have the professor who's supposed to be the voice of authority, but here it's the student, and worse, a student from the back of the room. And this was brought up by several folks in the conversation. The cultural perception, at least within the United States, is that students who sit in the back of the room are less academically engaged or not particularly good students. So the fact that it is the student from the back of the room who is, in fact, more astute than the professor is a complete subversion of that paradigm. So when we encounter these moments of two cultural schemes that don't match up, a term that's used to identify this is rich points, and this was coined by Michael Agar, who's an American linguistic anthropologist. So his sort of definition of rich points is that they describe what happens to someone who enters a novel, meaning new, linguistic or cultural context and encounters something that is puzzling, term, action, style of discourse, or conversation, which differs from the frame that the researcher brings to the situation. Now, of course, he's talking about researchers and as anthropologists, and rich point meaning, oh, this is great, you know, we get to do a rich analysis of these kinds of tension points. But for language learners, rich points can be quite frustrating. So, because these are cultural constructs that we don't see, so we can't really analyze them. But in any event, it brings us to the question of, okay, so why social reading? So a text, what I'm hoping to point out in this, my textual analysis, is that a text provides so many potential access points for making meaning. So when we compare social reading to, say, solitary reading, we see that solitary reading limits the range of relatable knowledge and experience. And then people will often say to me, yes, but we do social reading essentially in class when we have class discussions. I say, yes, but class discussions, of course, invoke power differentials. So you have teacher-students, outspoken students, and shy students, and this can affect who speaks and what they say. So we're going to keep that thought in mind, and I'm going to go back to this question of rich points, and well, let's ask the question of what happens when students don't notice rich points. So Swaffer and Ahrens in 2006 published a book. It's really one of the first or early books about pedagogical sort of applications for multiple literacies. It's called Remapping the Foreign Language Curriculum, an Approach Through Multiple Literacies. And they say that research on foreign language reading suggests that students resist correction of first impressions, that initial misapprehensions about textual features can become entrenched misreadings. So their sense is that apparently without prior orientation to key vocabulary, foreign language students' faulty cultural schemata can result in their maintaining a flawed reading despite subsequent textual clues to the contrary. And I'm sure you can imagine in your own classrooms, you've encountered this a number of times, where students are reading, and they've taken a turn, based, of course, on the default system of their own cultural schemes, in making meaning out of a text, and it's just not plugging into all of these context clues that are in the text, and they seem to be stuck in this rut. So how do we deal with this? The standard practice is that the teacher or the textbook provides pre or during reading explanations of these kind of unknown linguistic or cultural meanings. But social reading can scaffold a process of discovery based on critical feeling. This is a newer term that I actually talk about in the FLLITE approach that I've developed as a pedagogy of meaning making. So critical feeling plus critical thinking. And the FLLITE approach, again, it proposes a sequence of social reading strategies in order to address this. So the objective is empowering students to notice rich points in a text and to be able to take steps to resolve them, which is a real-world task. You know, it's one thing to be able, as a teacher or textbook, to forestall misinterpretation of something, but in order for students in the real world to be able to deal with them, you have to help them to develop certain strategies that will transfer over, right, ultimately into encounters in the real world, not just reading strategies. So if you go to, I'm giving you the visual here, to the eComma website, this is the home page. In the tab that is called Testing and Adopting eComma, there is a sub-page on information for teachers. And then within that, there is an eComma lesson planning guide. And this is a guide that was put together by Sarah Sweeney, who's one of the members at COERLL. And she's done just a great job of making social reading very accessible, hands-on through this guide, walks you through all of the needed areas. So I'll just talk you through a little bit this table of contents. So of course, information about installing eComma, what is social reading and the features. This we've covered. Choosing a text, I chose it for you. But things like preparing the text, deciding on lesson objectives, structuring the lesson, and she gives you this sequence of steps that might be productive for helping students to basically unpack meaning depending on your objectives. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Other considerations might be the comment language. Do you use the L1 or the L2 or both? Comment format, synchronicity. So social reading can be carried out either inside of the classroom, so synchronously, all the students at the same moment at the same time, or it can be done asynchronously, essentially outside of the classroom as homework. There are also questions of moderation, digital reading awareness. There's a lot of work that's being done in the cognitive sciences to try to understand social reading better. I mean, not just social reading, but reading comprehension. So there's some information about that. And then we get to assessment. And actually, in the assessment page, there is a link to a document that I provided with work, because I have done work with social reading for a number of years, starting one of the first, I guess, people, Carl can confirm, people to when they were test piloting, to actually do a test pilot in 2010, I think it was. Anyway, so in this document about social reading, I propose a sequence of what I'll call FLLITE reading strategies. FLLITE is foreign languages and the literary in the everyday. The approach more general that I've developed. So anyway, these 4 strategies. The first is red flagging. So I say, read with your gut. Whenever you experience a point of tension, surprise, annoyance, curiosity, disapproval, confusion, etc., flag the word or passage by highlighting it and write a comment that identifies your reaction. So often, you know, students are told to just think critically, right? But here, this is about feeling. Go with your intuitions. Try to plug into your intuitions as you're reading so that they can provide some fruitful or potentially fruitful directions for inquiry. So the second step then is questioning the text and assumptions. So, right, what kind of questions can you ask that would help you to think anew about something? What are you assuming based on your own cultural schemata? And then finding evidence in both in the text and through internet research, because the wonderful thing about digital social reading is that you're already, you know, online. You can do some quick research and then come back to the text, and you can formulate an evidence-based interpretation, which is the 4th step. So in your comment thread, you can post a definition or a synonym or or an explanation, whatever can work succinctly. You can even include links. to other things, and there have been suggestions by users to be able to upload images, which may happen at some point. But in any event, here's something that I say, which I think is important. Do not make guesses based on what you feel or imagine. Now, critical feeling and imagining are extremely important, but it depends on where in the process you engage in that. That's for starting off the process and also in middle steps. But in the final steps, because you don't want to trust your cultural scheme, you want to be able to question it and work potentially against it or in different directions. So in that final step, do not make guesses based on what you feel or imagine. Go with what you find in the text and whatever information your colleagues, collaborators have given, and together come to a much more reasoned from that L2 position. And in fact, this is what Claire Kromsch refers to as symbolic competence, and that kind of third space, right? Putting together both insider, outsider perspectives and coming to your own understanding. So along with those reading strategies in that document that I indicated, I also include a sample assessment rubric. Because this is, of course, is the reality. It's wonderful to envision new ways of working, but you also have to envision new tools for assessment. So you can find that there. All right, I also wanted to take a few moments and talk about the applications that you can find in the various case studies that have been uploaded to the, not just uploaded actually, but because there is a peer review process, you can submit a very simple, it's an informal sort of case study. If you work with social reading and, whether it's with eComma or not, because there are many different platforms that you can carry out social reading, digital social reading with. So just to give you some idea of the range of things that have already been discussed in these case studies. The first is actually from COERLL about analyzing variation, a focus on forms. And this goes back to the text in Louisiana Creole. This was for a course in French sociolinguistics. And what's interesting is that he uses the word cloud to find variations in spellings, because Louisiana Creole is a non-standardized written language. So you have to make those associations with both spoken language and then finding through the word cloud the specific instances of let's say non-standardized spellings, variations in spellings. So in general, we can use social reading, and in this case with eComma, to focus on forms. The second case study is one actually that I had done years ago at the introductory level, the first semester of French, where I decided, even though we're told you're supposed to really not use the L1 in classrooms, I thought, well, for social reading and for meaning making, I want to allow my first semester students to go deeply into a text and get what they can from it. And the only way for them to do that is in English. So, or the L1 as a shared, English as the shared, let's say L1, even though it's not a lot of people's L1s. So using English in order to post their comments, even though it's a foreign language class. The third one is from Chantel Warner at University of Arizona on modes of narrative reading. And this was for a graduate course entitled Literacy Through Literature. And here the focus was on the comment thread. But in particular, the kinds of aesthetic reactions that students had reading certain texts, and about the impacts reactions or impacts that they had from reading different narrative modes in a text. So the text involved what's called both immersive and interactive modes, narrative modes. So interactive meaning the author addresses the reader as you at certain happens with those shifts in perspective, and how does that impact both aesthetic and emotional response on the part of the reader. The next one, again by COERLL, is Surrealist Poetry, and this was for an intermediate French class. In some ways similar in terms of process with what Chantal had done. This is a focus again on comments, reacting to the text, surreal, non sequiturs, and juxtapositions, what effect this had on readers. But what was very nice too is the use of heat maps, because COERLL also, I mean, it's not COERLL, eComma, also, and you can plug into heat maps that show where is visually, where are students focusing on a text? Where are, I mean, you can highlight the specific language, but also the heat map shows the collective kind of impact of selecting passages in a text, so you can get a sense of what are the real focal points, where are people interacting with the text, and what that then means. What does that reveal as a result? So what was nice in this activity is that students also ended up linking in surrealist images to their annotations, so they were bridging kind of the visual, the experiential, and the symbolic. The next one is inductive grammar teaching, and this is by Alexander Lawrence, also at UT. And this was for a German class, and it was about adjectives and adjective endings, and where you find these in the text. And by examining where they are in their local context, you can interpret meanings and ultimately then devise rules about when and why one would use these different adjective endings. So a nice inductive development of meaning and use. The next is enhancing the ACTFL 3 modes of communication, by Mira Angrist, I guess is the last name, at Boston University. And this was actually for a class in Hebrew. And she engages with interpretation of a poem and starts off using the word cloud for predicting content, then tagging verbs in the past tense. And she asked students, all the students, to select 2 sentences or lines to comment on. Then they have to respond to 2 of their collaborators' comments. And then at the end, they have to actually finish the poem. They have to write the 3 last lines of the poem. So it's a really lovely sequencing of all the various modes that one can engage in. And finally, then there is creating meaning through social interaction with Mabel Morales, and I hope that I think you are here with us today, Mabel. So, little shout out to you. This was done in a lower division Spanish class, again interpreting a poem. And what's interesting, of course, poems are often used because for short text, they're such wonderful. They encode so many different layers of meaning, and just provide a very rich environment for responding. And in conjunction with that, I'll mention here that one of the it depends if you want to call it a constraint or not, but I guess in the literal sense you can call it a constraint, that in eComma, for a page, you really should not exceed the 200 word count of your text. So that might mean that you will only use an excerpt from a text, or it might mean that you will choose to create several pages and therefore several tabs, a tab for each page, in order to look across from one page to the next to read a longer text. So in any event, what was nice about Mabel's work in this was that she had students work in small groups and analyze different stanzas, thereby distributing the cognitive load and emphasizing collaboration through a more information gap kind of approach. She also then, in terms of one level of assessing comprehension, she had students matching stanzas to either figurative or symbolic images. So these different levels of meaning making. So a lot of possibilities. And I wanted to mention also another possibility for FLAC courses. I don't know if you're using FLAC courses at your institutions, but FLAC courses, the acronym for foreign languages across the curriculum. And these are courses that combine a foreign language and a discipline-based course. So, for example, history, religion, or business. And for a course that intersects with, let's say, a particular country or language in relationship to that discipline, you have the optional 1 credit, 1 hour section where texts are in fact read and discussed in the foreign language. So for courses like that, you can have students in the FLAC section participate in one of the main course sections, social reading of a text in English, and to widen access to rich points from differing domains of knowledge and experience in order to go deeper into the text. So, all right, let's step back and take a look at the various affordances of digital social reading. I've given you a number of ideas about how one can apply it and some of the tools. So I mentioned earlier that when you have this difficulty of power sort of differentials in the classroom, one of the affordances of digital social reading is that every student has an equal voice when typing comments. So it's democratic. And students also feel less pressure to say the right thing than when they're in a face-to-face environment. So it's emboldening. Students can make meaning in ways not dictated by textbooks and teachers. It's truly autonomous. And again, depending on how you structure your social reading, I tend to do it as a first reading. I really let students have at it, right? So, and I don't, I don't participate in the comment thread at that point. So we, especially at lower level textbooks, everything is about already from the pre-reading. The textbook has already pretty much defined where students are going to be going with their understanding of the text, and then the during reading and the post-reading becomes this rather cloistered interpretation. Then you have the fact that we've already talked about the inductive process, that students can recognize patterns, solve problems, build hypotheses, and the fact that you can share knowledge and experiences to broaden the range of what they learn from each other is truly collaborative. Students can also react viscerally. They can invoke their critical feelings and approach the text from different angles. The digital environment allows for easy incorporation of internet search results, so it's also exploratory. Teachers can better understand what students actually comprehend in a text, including students who don't speak much in class. So when I say actually comprehend in the text, I think I should amend that to say we see better where students are having problems. We can see where they're really getting off track and where we need to bring in further work to scaffold better understanding. Which leads to this next one, that students can learn concepts at home in a flipped classroom environment, but then teachers can better design follow-up classwork based on the outcomes. Right, so I always gave it asynchronously so that I would have time to really read through the comment thread and prepare a very tailored kind of follow-up to what they had produced. Students can stop and return later to continue reading. They can also respond to other students' comments that came after their initial reading, or they can review as class preparation. So imagine over the course of 2 days, the student who began, or the few students who began the process, won't benefit from that richness of interpretation, collaborative interpretation. So I ask that prior to the class that everyone go back and read as class preparation for the discussion and work that we do in class. Students can use e-comma on any device, of course, anywhere, anytime with an internet connection, so it's accessible. And no paper is required. Text and activities can be reused, so in that sense, it is green. So many affordances to be gained from social reading. And what I'd like to do now is your turn. I know this is a lot of information to absorb. Take a few moments and just think about if you want to make a note of some possible applications that you can think of. So maybe think about what kind of format you would use, or an objective. Even be a more straightforward question of, could you see using it, yes or no? Right? Is this something that would fit into your course, yes or no? Okay. I see Carl has said, I would love to annotate a text in images and sound. That would be so much fun. Absolutely. And if you manage to do that, then please share that with us. Sybil says, my colleague and I are planning to incorporate social reading in a 4th semester German course. Excellent. So I don't know if you've already worked with social reading. Since you're already planning to incorporate it, I imagine you have your objectives somewhat identified. But yes, if you would afterwards, please share your work with us on the case study page. Carl also says, I've thought about having native and non-native teams annotate a text. We can analyze the differences in their annotation activity. Yeah. Jody says, comment boxes. Oh, not showing in my computer. That's to Natalie. Sorry. Oops. So Kelly says, I can actually see myself using this strategy in my methods course. Yeah. Currently I have students do reading notes where they choose a quote to share, something for which they would like clarification, and how they might apply a strategy. I think the ability for them to complete this online would be simpler for me and would give them opportunities to see what others are thinking as well. Yes, exactly. Lisa says you could create a word cloud that is generated by the comments. Could you create a word cloud generated by the comments? Oh, that's an interesting question. That's one for Carl to answer. I will make this point too, is that along with this being an open meaning that teachers and students have access to eComma for free and with tech support by the COERLL team, which is already quite phenomenal. You can actually have your institution or some kind of an IT, software developer modify. It's open for modification on that level as well. So if eComma doesn't have a feature that you would like to use, you can ask someone to create it for you. So that might be one possibility. Jeff says, I like its place in flipped learning. Yeah, both as an out-of-class task and then later in class too, where we've had a chance to play with the text and, as you said, see where difficulties emerge. Natural scaffolding, exactly. Cecilia, I have a couple of questions. A, is there a way to make it so students don't see other students' comments prior to their own reading of a text of a page? Not in the way that it's currently set up. But again, that could be modified. And B, I imagine that a good way to assess students' engagement with the activity is through comments. Doesn't it get a little messy when you have comments from 25 students? Well, that is why you can either look independently. If you go back to that list, you can look on just what students, the comments that each student have made without the other students, or you can download and go through it. In the assessment tool that or the little rubric that I provide with the 4 interpretation strategies, the first time you do it, it might be a little time consuming, but you start to be able to assess quickly what students are doing, and it depends on what you ask them to do. You can see through the various applications that we saw in the case studies that sometimes they have more constrained or how should I say, more explicit kinds of things to respond to, and you can quickly assess that. Otherwise, it's more interpretive. So it takes a little experimenting with to see what works for you. As Carl says, we actually removed the feature, but removed it because it was buggy and people didn't use it very much. Okay. Was that the feature? Oh, yes, from Lisa. Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay, that's an interesting point. All right, so since we don't have a lot of time, thank you for your input. That was really, really very interesting. I'm going to start my conclusion by looking at what research in reading comprehension has had to say. And this is starting in an article by Per Erlaub in Foreign Language Annals in 2013. And he began his article by reporting on research results that Elizabeth Bernhard had come to that spanned really a number of years of research. And I think that if you may agree with me, but based on the kind of work that I'd always done with textbook kind of teaching, right, and standard teaching, it rings true just even intuitively. So she says that 30% of second language learning competence is attributed to the reader's knowledge of the second language. 20% results from background knowledge and first language literacy. And then the remaining 50% encompasses what Bernhard called unexplained variance, and that included things like comprehension strategies, content and domain knowledge, interest and motivation, etc. So for me, here are my problematics in thinking about those research results. It raises the question of what are our assumptions about knowledge of second language, and what are our assumptions about, quote, comprehension strategies, interest, motivation, etc. Right? So here are my conclusions. Digital social reading is something that students are, in essence, actually already doing in their socially mediated lives. So scaffolding appropriate practices turns social reading into a social intellectual practice. And it's one that not only benefits language learners, but helps students in any discipline. So in fact, social reading is transdisciplinary and one that could, and I would say should, be used to some degree in any discipline. And when I say degree, I think that's another point that's important to make, is that when in teaching French classes, it's not that I took away all solitary readings in class discussions and replaced everything with social reading. In the course of a semester, I generally had students do 3 social readings. It's meant to complement and expand, right, reading literacy practices. And for assessment, I would actually use my little rubric and those reading strategies. And the first 2 times that they did a social reading, I didn't give a grade for it. I simply gave them feedback based on those steps and what I was seeing what students were doing. And then the 3rd time we did it, I would do a summative assessment for them for the semester. That social reading, I forget, it might have been 5 or maximum 10% of the course grade. So going on with my conclusions, so multiliteracy's approaches are helping to transform foreign language teaching into pedagogies of meaning making. And new technologies are helping to scaffold new modes of interaction with text, whether they're written, oral, or visual. So thus we have the notion of the digital humanities. And together, this will recalibrate comprehension results. So there's no question that we will need longitudinal studies to better understand the long-term gains and losses. But for me, the rich point here is recognizing that digital social reading is here to stay. So if we have a few moments for the Q&A, questions, comments, reactions. Someone says that 3 times in a semester seems too few to give students a chance to get fluent with social reading. Well, I think that depends in part on the level of the class. I actually, along with social reading, it's not the only kind of form, digital social reading wasn't the only form of let's say, other kinds of literacy development that I use. I also have a kind of, I would alternate social reading with this kind of solitary reading, but guided solitary reading that got students to think more deeply into a text. So my concern in some ways was that if we did too many social readings, that students would kind of tire of it. So I like to keep it fresh, but that is something for you to experiment with. And if it's something that is done more programmatically from level to level, it's not just something that one individual teacher does in his or her classroom, you know, outside, in a sense, of the standard practices in a particular language program. If I try to imagine that it's done sequentially, I mean, across the curriculum in different levels, then students gain real skill from level to level. And then you can do very interesting things like in the first semester you have students writing their comments in English. Second semester they can start to write in the foreign language brief comments, things, to say things like, oh, hey, look at this. This is interesting. I like this, those kinds of comments. You can also then in the third semester really scaffold how to write comments. It's a genre in and of itself, right? How to write comments in the foreign language. Keeping in mind that those comments, it's not meant to be an accuracy task. It's meant to really develop fluency. But nonetheless, you can develop your kind of genre conventions to facilitate them doing this in the foreign language. Even in third semester, though, I always gave students the option of expressing something in English because the goal is so much more about going in depth and making meaning. And even when I do that, I find that students often choose to continue to do it. They'll do it in the foreign language, and even if it's pretty jumbled, they feel excited about working in this more spontaneous vein, doing it in the second language.
Joanna, yes. So I'm the voice that says time is up. It's 3 o'clock. And
Yes.
we thank you very much to Joanna for all of her interesting ideas on how to use all the techniques for how to use social reading. If you're interested, please visit the website and ask us any questions about implementation. We'll make sure that you get the help that you need to use it in your classroom. Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Joanna, for animating this discussion.
Excellent. Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye.